Welcome all to this, in my opinion, very, very interesting seminar, which touches upon a number of areas where biological diversity is one, planning is one, governance is one, drylands is one, we have gender, and it's a pity that we are at the time of the year where very many are planning for other things, but I hope that you who are here will have a very, very interesting hour together. And I hope that the recorded message will spark a good discussion and thinking for you who work with these kinds of projects, and also in the dryland areas, because we all would like to ensure that we increase the ability for people to survive in their homelands and not to do harm. We will listen to the recorded presentation. After that, we will have a question and answer section, and I will moderate that.
Hello, I'm David Pertaub. I'm a researcher in the climate change group at IIED. My work focuses on climate resilience and local governance, particularly in the drylands of East Africa, and especially Kenya and Tanzania. A lot of what I do involves developing and assessing participatory planning tools. That's activities that allow communities to participate meaningfully in local planning processes. I've worked on toolkits to bring out the specific climate resilience needs of women and youth, but I'm also interested in digital participatory mapping. That's a technique that allows local people to map out their land use patterns and explain them to government. I'm here today with Seth Hesse, Senior Fellow from the Climate Change Group. He has many decades of experience in issues of dryland development and pastoralism. Today's presentation is called Poor Governance is Worse Than Drought, and we will discuss issues around water development in the drylands. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Despite billions of dollars of investment in water development over multiple decades, access to clean and reliable water remains a mirage for millions of people, particularly in LDCs. It's been estimated that in 2017, 54.7% of people in rural areas of sub-Saharan Africa lacked access to even a basic drinking source. This is a really shocking failure to meet the aspirations of Sustainable Development Goal number 6. It's particularly acute during the COVID pandemic, when access to soap and water for hand washing is critical to avoid the spread of disease. There is, however, another failing that's less visible and not sufficiently appreciated, that of failing to pay careful attention to the political and power dynamics that surround water development. Ignoring these can undermine local people's livelihood systems, degrade the environment, trigger social tensions, and exacerbate poverty. Today's talk will explore how water development interventions intersect with wider complex power dynamics at multiple scales. It will present 3 case studies of water development in dryland environments in northern Kenya, where the main livelihood system is pastoralism. Now, in these areas, the government and development agencies have broadly agreed that water scarcity is the major issue for development. They've also concluded that the solution is to build a lot of water points throughout the territory. Today's talk shows how taking power into account unsettles those simplistic assumptions. The first case study will show how water development has often been used to exercise power over communities. The second shows a more positive view, how water development can involve power with and power between local communities, helping them meet their priorities. Lastly, the third example shows how water development can address issues of unequal power within communities. The talk will conclude with some principles for using water infrastructure planning and governance that explicitly embrace power, and show how water governance can serve as an entry point for multiple objectives, addressing marginalisation, sustainable livelihoods, gender and social equity, and building climate resilience. To really understand the political and power dimensions of water development in dryland pastoralist areas, one needs to appreciate the pivotal role of water in pastoralist livelihood systems. In fact, water is key to the sustainable use of variable and dispersed resources in the environment. In northern Kenya, there are distinct rainy seasons when fresh, nutritious pastures grow and when surface water is temporarily available. You can see that on the left here on the slide. These are followed by dry seasons when the pastures gradually dry up and lose their nutritional value. Surface water disappears, and people and livestock rely on underground water, sometimes having to dig deep into the riverbeds of seasonal watercourses. Pastoralists in northern Kenya have developed a system of communal management for making the most of this changing availability of resources across the environment. They collectively agree to set aside some areas for grazing their animals in the wet season, when surface water is abundant. Other areas are set aside only for dry season grazing, or as drought reserves. These are only to be used at times of intense climate stress. Here the grass is left to grow during the rainy season, creating a stock of fodder, which is saved for livestock in the driest periods or during droughts. But they've got to be careful to protect these areas to make sure that no grazing takes place in the wet season, and these areas can be extensive and very difficult to police. Control of water is the linchpin of this whole system, because animals need both water and pasture to survive. Grass without nearby water is useless. So if you can ration or control water near a protected dry season grazing area, you can completely prevent grazing out of season, and you can control the number of animals consuming the resource. In practice, what this means is that pastoralists generally have a few strategically placed water points in their dry season grazing areas and drought reserves. These points are carefully managed by local institutions that regulate access as a function of the availability of the surrounding pasture. These institutions also keep the peace with other nearby pastoralist groups that may want to make use of the pasture. But as the case studies will show, unequal power dynamics in the development of water infrastructure can easily disrupt or undermine these traditional land use systems, leading to reduced livestock productivity, environmental degradation, and social conflict. Our first case study is from Wajir, a vast arid county in the northeast of Kenya, bordering Ethiopia and Somalia. It's a nomadic pastoralist economy with cattle, camels, goats, sheep, and donkeys. This case study highlights how water infrastructure development can be an expression of power over a community. It shows what happens when water development is based on top-down interventions which are informed by negative policy narratives that perhaps perceive pastoralism to be inefficient, backwards, and a cause of environmental degradation. In the late 1960s in Wajir, a livestock development project, funded by USAID and SIDA, tried to end traditional land use systems of wet and dry season grazing. They wanted to introduce the ranching model of livestock production instead of mobile pastoralism. They tried to partition the rangelands into standard grazing blocks. Now, water development was an integral part of this project of wholesale transformation. Boreholes were drilled to provide water for each of the new grazing blocks created. The whole system was regulated by project technicians who would limit livestock numbers with regular offtake and destocking. By the mid-1990s, the ranching schemes had failed and they had been abandoned. The drivers of water development then changed. The location of water infrastructure was determined by the ambitions of politicians from outside the county, working together with local clan-based elites. There were clear electoral benefits in establishing new settlements to concentrate votes, and many new water points were built to serve these new settlements. They were built regardless of local existing patterns of land use. It was political manipulation that drove the siting of water. So what are the consequences of this type of top-down or politically motivated water development, this power over local pastoralists? What's been happening in Wajir is that too much water is being supplied in the wrong places. It's being supplied without concern for the delicate ecological balance between water and grazing. That means that the distinction between wet season, dry season, and drought reserve areas has largely broken down over the decades. The map on this slide shows the location of the most important water points in Wajir in 2019. It's taken from a recent project undertaken by IIED in collaboration with the County of Wajir. The blue lozenges indicate the location of boreholes, and the bigger the lozenge, the more water the borehole can dispense. These can be particularly disruptive for traditional land use systems. More water means more animals will use the surrounding pastures, and many of the boreholes will be operational throughout the year. Then there's the sheer number of water points. Back in the 1940s, there were only 4 water points located in dry season grazing reserves, which is almost certainly too few. But by the early 2000s, with various rounds of water investments, this had increased to well over 75. And this enthusiasm for spending on new water points continues to this day. Between 2013 and 2018, the number of boreholes in Wajir rose from 98 to 272. As a result of unplanned water provision, the rangeland hardly gets any periods to recover, resulting in overgrazing, degradation, and loss of valuable biodiversity. This decreases the productivity of pastoralist livelihoods and increases climate vulnerability. So what if we do water development differently? What if we use water development as power with communities, allowing local people at the village level to decide their own priorities? Our next case study comes from the nearby Kenyan county of Isiolo, from one of IIED's key initiatives in the drylands, the County Climate Change Fund, or CCCF. The approach involves setting up and building the capacity of climate change committees elected by villagers. The committee members work with their own communities to choose, plan, and implement climate change investments that meet local priorities and needs. They work to known budgets and receive comprehensive training that allows them to act as real partners with local government in the formal planning system. So the community is in the saddle, and it's thinking about development and resilience. What do they decide to prioritize, knowing they have a limited budget? Unsurprisingly, water is a key priority, but among the various investments in the first wave of CCCF investments, one stands out. Take a look at this land use map of Isiolo. Notice the areas in green and in pink. Green are areas set aside for dry season grazing, and pink, they're critical reserves set aside for periods of drought. The grey bits are not controlled so carefully, but mostly used in the wet season. Where you see the star, that's the Yamicha water pan. It was built by an external development agency several decades ago, but it was built without consulting the local community. Now, when the local community was given a budget and asked to decide on climate change investments, what do you think they decided to do? They asked to fill in the water pan, to close it, to stop up the supply of water. And the rationale was critical. The Yamicha water pan, they said, was in the wrong place and was not under their control. It's bang in the middle of an emergency drought reserve, a place where no grazing should be permitted during normal times. The Yamicha water pan was making the area open access, like leaving an open door to a storeroom. It was also causing conflict with neighboring Somali pastoralists who were hopping across the border, helping themselves to the drought pasture whenever they wanted, and you can see that with the green arrow. So the community wanted the Yamicha water pan closed. At the same time, they wanted a nearby borehole rehabilitated. The borehole was a water source they could control. They could close it completely and deny access to the area until an extreme dry season or drought event occurred. That's a clear demonstration of how control over water confers power in the drylands, and how it's the key to sustainable rangeland management. How about the Somalis who were coming over the border? They lost out by losing the water pan. But in the drylands, neighboring communities usually have traditions of negotiable and reciprocal rights of access to water in times of distress. So the Somali elders could formally request access to the Yamicha borehole at times of distress, and most likely this would be granted, but in a controlled fashion, so that it would be a managed commons, not a free-for-all. Planned access would reduce the potential for conflict, and that's an example of water developed as power between communities. So we have seen the positive benefits of empowering local people to take the lead in planning water resources. For a third and final case study, we return to Wajir County and explore how water governance and planning needs to consider power within the community too. Although pastoralist customary institutions are great for sustainable rangeland management, it is elder men who dominate them, and their primary focus is the well-being of the herd and their animals. Women in pastoralist communities are responsible for domestic water collection, but they are largely excluded from decision-making about natural resources under traditional systems. Their access rights to water are secondary, meaning that livestock get watered first, and women may have long waiting times before they can draw water from a dirtied, muddied water pan, dam, or trough. As with any development intervention, water investments are embedded in local power dynamics at the village level too. We need to consider power within the community. Once again, it is attention to governance, attendance to who participates in decision-making, that is key to climate-resilient, equitable, socially inclusive outcomes. When designing local community planning institutions through the CCCF approach, IIED has engaged with these unequal gender dynamics in a number of ways. For example, individuals did not need to be literate to qualify for election to community planning committees, something that often bars women from participating. And prior to each election, the community was sensitized to the importance and relevance of having women on the committees. Once elected, members received special training and capacity building to build their skills. That's essential for pastoralist women who lack the confidence and skills for public engagement. The measures weren't perfect. As we all know, representation does not guarantee voice, and inequitable gender norms are still deeply entrenched in local pastoralist culture and traditions. But in communities in Wajir, the inclusion of women in planning processes led to very simple yet visible and effective changes in the design of the investments they selected. Changes that meant the needs of domestic water were also considered in addition to livestock's needs. The initial investment proposals the planning committees put together, they featured the usual fencing and protection of water pans to prevent unregulated use of the source. You can see the problems that they were having in the before pictures at the left. These plans also included a pumping system and tanks to channel water outside the fence to troughs. And these troughs were originally intended primarily for livestock. But the inclusion of women's perspectives in the design phase led to alterations of the original plans. As you can see in these photos from Wargadad and Lagbokol water pans, the piping systems were also made to serve a dedicated water kiosk with taps for women collecting domestic water. This one innovation addressed both gender and health issues in one go. The point is not that the design was completely new. This has been done elsewhere in many different places, but to point out how we can use water investment planning and governance as an entry point for addressing issues of power within the community, and we can achieve very real results. The case studies we have seen from the drylands show how deeply embedded water investments are in local power dynamics and political contexts. Investments that ignore these local contexts can undermine local people's livelihood systems, degrade the environment, trigger social tensions, and exacerbate poverty. But the case studies also show the potential for using water governance and planning as an entry point for challenging structural inequalities and power imbalances. It can be used to address historic and ongoing marginalization. It can help to build sustainable livelihoods, and it can strengthen the climate resilience of the most exposed social groups. This brings us to some fundamental principles that have informed IIED's work on governance and local government planning in the drylands in Kenya and elsewhere. Firstly, there's a basic need to understand and respect the logic of existing land use and systems of resource governance, recognizing how critical they are to sustainable livelihoods and climate resilience. Relatedly, there's a need to take a systemic and holistic approach rather than a sectoral one. So planners need to appreciate the complex interlinkages between the resources in the environment, the livelihood systems that depend on them, and the institutions that mediate access to these resources. This implies, thirdly, that there needs to be a landscape approach to planning. We should consider the full geographical area within which pastoralism is being practiced, the migration shed, if you will. Administrative and national boundaries often do not match the pastoralist patterns of resource use and seasonal mobility, so planning cannot stop at an artificial boundary. Fourthly, subsidiarity. In rural areas, local people depend heavily on natural resources such as water. They understand their environment intimately, and they experience the impacts of climate change most directly. Decision-making about water resources should be locally led, taken at the lowest feasible level by the communities that depend on those resources. Fifthly, the formal planning system should work hand in hand with informal traditional systems and institutions to determine and understand the priorities of local people and to encourage solutions that go with the grain of local context and conditions. This is easiest to achieve in countries where devolution has been implemented. And lastly, we need to remember power dynamics at the community level. East African pastoralist societies are gerontocratic. Women and young people have distinctive development and climate resilience priorities, but they are often excluded from decision-making. Socially just and climate resilient outcomes can only be achieved by addressing this power imbalance.
So that's David's presentation. Just wanted to mention in particular that Said Hesse, who is another senior fellow at IIED and is an expert on the livelihoods of dryland areas, particularly pastoralism, is also here for the Q&A that will follow. Johanna, over to you.
Thank you, Matt, and welcome everybody to this question and answer session. I have asked Ann-Sofie Aronsson to just give her sort of thought. What sprung to mind when she saw these three examples in planning, and is this something that she can bring with her, you know, in her work within the Africa department? So please, Ann-Sofie, if you have some kind of, you know, few thoughts on this.
Thank you, Johanna. I see now that we have many colleagues here as well that are much more of experts than I am. I work broadly on environment and climate change issues, supporting colleagues at the embassies in Africa. But one reflection that I make listening to your presentation is that we support many different agricultural programs, but sometimes, I mean, with a different main purpose, sometimes gender, sometimes peace building, broader resilience programs, climate adaptation, etc. So how do we make sure to, that's the challenge, to make sure that we integrate all these perspectives in our programs and not only work separately with our agricultural programs with different main purposes, if you see what I mean. So I think that is a challenge sometimes. And also I put in the chat here as well, we have, and I guess the example from Kenya with the communities making their own decisions on different investments. It's from your own program, this IIED programs, which was also funded by SIDA. And there are now plans to scale that program. And we are looking at that together with the embassy in Kenya. And I'm wondering how, I mean, having many smaller investments at the local level for climate adaptation and water development, etc., decided by communities. How do we make sure that as a whole, there's a scale of these impacts? I mean, how do we make sure, for example, in the case of Kenya, that it delivers to the Kenya's visions 2030, the development plan? These are also things that we are thinking about, and I think my colleagues also from the embassy in Kenya, which is participating, and also my colleagues from the embassy in Sudan, where we also have these very broad resilience program looking into nutrition, climate adaptation measures, many different aspects of resilience, would also be able to provide some input, perhaps. I know that Mali from the embassy in Sudan, she has a little bit of a bad connection, but perhaps she can make a comment as well. So sorry, it was more of questions that came to my mind, but hopefully it could also be an inspiration for the discussions.
Thank you, Ann-Sofi. That was more than I actually expected from you in this. But so maybe David and Sed can answer some of this, and I hope that the people who are here will enter the dialogue also. Please feel free. You can just raise your hand or put a question in the chat.
I'll take a stab first at answering the question on the many smaller different investments for climate adaptation and water development and so on and so forth. I mean, I think you have to remember that planning is taking place initially through the Kenyan devolution system, for example. The power is vested within the county to basically make the decisions and to establish planning across all development objectives. What we're trying to do here is to find ways of ensuring that the processes that are developed across all sectors are participatory, that they are transparent, and that they really work according to certain fundamental principles which respect the knowledge and understanding of local people. So the particular thing that we've been discussing, the particular program that we've been discussing, the CCCF, takes climate change as a particular entry point. But you could take other points as entry points as well. It's integrated in such a way that, I mean, Sed can go into more detail as to the specific allocations of funds, but the point being that there is an element that is driven by communities. There is an element that is driven by bottom-up priorities, but there are also other priorities that are coming from the county level downwards, so that there are priorities established both at county level in accordance with the CIDP, in accordance with the Kenyan Vision to 2030. And that is then percolates down through a proper system of governance, which is what we're trying to promote, a transparent and accountable and participatory system of governance that allows local communities to understand what those priorities are and to then engage with them and to bring their distinctive knowledge and understanding of what's happening on the ground and meet in the middle, as it were. So the essence, the meat, is to set up a system of governance in which there is this percolation down and also this gradual process of priorities coming from the bottom up. And the aim is to establish such a system where decisions come from the bottom and are integrated and modified and filtered through the Kenyan Vision 2030. And that would be my take on it. I don't know, Sed, how would you take that?
No, that's it. I mean, subsidiarity is the key thing here. It's recognizing that some water development needs to be done at the village or the community level, and that may be domestic water. Other water developments needs to be developed at scale, and that would be like livestock water points would be one, because it would be cross ward. It could even be cross county, and that would be driven by the county, but in close sort of consultation with local communities. And then there'll be national level sort of water development. And so it's making sure those nested approaches are coherent with each other and align, and don't one doesn't prejudice the other. So I think it's and I guess, you know, one needs to look at the other side. Is I don't have the statistics, but you know, Kenya has probably over the years, donor partners in Kenya and the government have invested billions of dollars in water development in northern Kenya, going back 30, 40, 50 years. And yet we still have this situation where most people do not have access to clean, reliable water, you know, and we are 2021. So I think one needs to also look at some of the policies, and certainly the Kenyan water policy, when one looks at it for its relevance for the drylands, there are serious problems with that policy that need to be reviewed, because it's been designed with a sort of one-size-fits-all view that water development is largely technical. It's sort of, there is a governance angle, but it's seen largely as a technical issue to address issues of scarcity, particularly in the drylands, without really understanding fundamentally the dynamics of these environments and how they work. And you need a policy which will work for coastal areas, which will work for the drylands, which will work for the highlands and Western Kenya. It'll all be different, and that's where subsidiarity needs to be a central feature of this policy, which it is in the extent of transferring the responsibilities for paying for water, but less so for transferring the responsibilities for the governance of that water.
Okay, thank you, David, and thank you, Said. It seems like Mali has a very poor internet connection, but she has a comment in the chat which says that she thinks that country-based water stress is resulted from both scarcity and poor governance. So maybe if you can, is this something you can develop a little bit, and David and Said?
I mean, I think that the narrative of scarcity is very prevalent in development circles, and it serves a lot of different purposes. And although it's undoubtedly true that climate change is having an impact on ecosystems and it will be creating water scarcity, increased water scarcities in certain areas, the problems that are encountered, for example, increased conflict, often have to do with very different factors that have to do with perhaps governance or political failures at maybe the state level or at other levels. There are lots of drivers of, for example, conflict, and there are lots of drivers of lack of access to water that have nothing specifically to do with climate change or increasing scarcity, or they could be dealt with if we were able to look at the governance mechanisms and to engage with traditional and customary institutions, or at least to create hybrid institutions that built on the existing resources of people in these areas. One of the aspects about dryland areas is that they have been dealing with climate variability. They have been dealing with water scarcity for a very, very, very long time. They have strategies that they have developed. They have institutions that have evolved over time to deal with these kinds of issues. And what we must not do in water development is override them or undermine these institutions. We should look for ways in which these institutions can be empowered to help at times of water scarcity. So yes, there may be increasing water scarcity down to climate change, but there are the means there within the institution, within the communities themselves. There are the means that have evolved over long periods of time to deal with those situations, and we should value them. We should understand what they are. We should take time to understand what they are, and we should work together with them, because governance can actually be the key to dealing with the water scarcity issues. As the title of the talk is, poor governance is worse than drought, which really says it all. It's like if you do not manage your resources, if you do not work well with controlling and managing access to the scarce resources that there are, you are going to end up with problems. So I would say governance, although there is scarcity, governance is a key point of actually addressing that issue. And often the scarcity narrative is one that is used to hide failings at multiple other levels. That would be my take on it. Said, I don't know.
No, I mean, we need to look at scarcity from two perspectives, I think, particularly in dryland areas. And it's the perspective of scale over time and scale over space, over geography. So drylands, as we know, are defined, well, we saw you have this wet seasons when there is no scarcity. There is plenty of water. Well, it depends on the year. And that so you have time at different scales. You have the year, and then you have multiple years, and you have the seasons. So to understand scarcity, you need to look at it at different scales of time. And then the other one is, again, in drylands, look at it in terms of geography. So maybe where you are physically, there is a problem of scarcity. But if you have livestock mobility that functions, you can take your animals and find water and nutritious grasses somewhere else. So I think it's looking at those dynamics and then looking at how do you do water development within that framework. But to see scarcity as a sort of a constant problem. And that is what we saw from the first case study that was shown in Wajir, that there's a perception that there is water scarcity is a constant. Then the reaction has been, well, let's put in more and more water. That's been going on for decades. It hasn't resolved the problem of scarcity when it occurs. It has exacerbated it in many cases. So high yielding boreholes, suck up huge amounts of groundwater and pump it out. Large irrigation schemes, have been implemented in northern Kenya, none of which have worked. So I think looking at water management now is to recognize in dryland environments, you do have variable conditions. Scarcity is relative to time and to space, and therefore water development needs to be done within that framework.
Thank you, Said. That was very interesting. I will. We have two questions, two raised hands, David Lymer and Erik Pettersson. But I will, before I let them in, I will ask one question. And since I have worked for many years partly with similar issues, so we know that irrigation schemes have been, many times brought up as sort of kind of a messiah, to solve population growth and to increase productivity and so on. But what I think I hear you say is that we need to work with the conditions, not against them. And to me, you read about salination and so on. We are trying to create conditions in places where it's not really possible. So could you just give a quick return on that, and then I will let in Erik and David.
I think it comes back to some of the earlier points David made, in that the drylands historically have been seen as problematic because of their variable nature. That variability is seen intrinsically as a problem, as a constraint, particularly for food security. And therefore the historical sort of engagement by development partners and governments in the drylands has been to try and eliminate that variability and to introduce food production which isolates nature, which somehow removes nature from the process. And there are two good examples. In the farming sector, it's large irrigation schemes. So you're able to grow lettuces and tomatoes and other crops which are not suited for the drylands, and you grow them under high intensive conditions, a lot of technology, a lot of money, and you create these large schemes which also have other effects in that they displace local people. There's a lot of work that's been done along the Awash Valley in Ethiopia, where sugarcane and cotton has been introduced and displaced pastoralists. And yet research has shown that the actual returns on that land and the returns on the water used by cotton and by sugar are far inferior to the livestock sort of production systems. Or in the livestock sector, the approach has been to do ranching, as was seen in Wajir in the early 1960s. In this, so let's suppress mobility, let's suppress the use of working with wet season and working with dry season, which is the way the pastoralists do, where they work with nature. They suppress that by creating large sort of ranching lots and then bring water there rather than look for water. Water is provided. But those failed as well, as they have in many other parts of Kenya. In southern Kenya, the group ranch scheme also, which was slightly different, also has failed and led to a lot of land degradation, social marginalization, and so on. So I think one needs to look at, and it's very relevant for the drylands, but I think more broadly within the debate on climate change, is we need to work with nature, not against nature. And we've seen the working against nature is partly the cause of climate change. These high industrialized ways of producing livestock, which we know have very heavy carbon footprints. And it's the same with agriculture as well. So I think, Joanna, I think, what we've seen is dryland communities have worked with nature for centuries. They have institutions and strategies for doing that. They have very rarely been supported. In many ways, policy has undermined what they're trying to do. So it's not to say that they are the panacea and have all the answers, but that should be our starting point, is learn how do communities living in drylands manage variability and build on that knowledge and support that and support their processes. Sorry, it's a bit long.
Okay, I think if we are going to have time with 3 questions, I am sorry, David, I will leave you out. So I will start with Eric. Please, Eric, pose your question.
Thank you very much. So my name is Eric Pedersen. I'm working in SIDA's Peace and Human Security Unit at the SIDA headquarters in Stockholm, where we implemented our thematic peace building strategy. So I've been here for 4 years. Before that, I was working on Somalia for 5 years. So I think this drylands and pastoralism is something important. So one reflection or a question I have is on, well, from a peace building perspective, and I guess that is the case, like, you're starting kind of with a thematic focus. You kind of address this geographical zones from that perspective, and in the peace building world, I guess a common feature is to set up these peace committees in different areas, and I know that has been done in Kenya also. So can you talk a bit about like the committees that you are setting up, how they relate to this peace committees? Are they the same or different, or have you come across the peace committees in some ways? Would be interesting. And also in this discussion, we also in a region with a very high population growth, and the growth, or well, the demand for meat is increasing, I assume. So would you say that like, is that also putting increased pressure on producing more meat, and how that is kind of influencing the need for water and production, apart from climate change, then as another pressure? And then a third question I had is if I know from when I worked on Somalia, it's increasingly starting to use solar power to pump water. Is that making any difference compared to having a diesel generator, apart from the environmental benefits, but like in the governance of this water systems? But thank you for an interesting presentation.
Okay, challenging questions, David. And Said, who wants to go first?
Said, do you want to take over this?
Okay, on peace committees, yes. I mean, there are peace committees in Kenya. And I guess the difference, so we were working with the County Climate Change Fund mechanism, which has been supported by SIDA, I should also say, and has sort of contributed to the relative success of the approach. Now it's been scaled out sort of nationwide in Kenya. But what we found is when we started this work, there was no shortage of committees. There's the water committee, there's the peace committee, there's the health committee, there's the parents committee, there is so on. And what we found was most committees were not functional. They didn't work. And often you got the same people in multiple committees. And those people were either local elites or the people who have the luxury to be able to participate in those processes. But they certainly didn't include the most vulnerable or those who were really active and sort of leading their lives. So, so the approach we adopted was to try and say, we drew on the experience at the time in Kenya. This was in 2009, 2010, when there'd been a really interesting process of the election of the judges in Kenya, where they did it. I'm trying to think now the exact term that they used. It's just escaped me in my mind. But what it is people were you had an election process that that's right, public vetting. So people were chosen not through an election process, sort of where you voted, but through a public voting or public vetting, where that vetting was done with everybody knowing. So what that meant in practice was somebody said, I want to be a member of this committee, and then there would be a community meeting to judge whether or not that person was fit for purpose. So it was investing quite a lot in that. But what we got from the climate change committees was a much stronger accountability of those elected members, and rather than sort of doing it the Western way where you vote in secret. There's more on that, but we don't have time. In terms of the demand for meat and growing urban population, growing middle class population, and I mean this is a debate which is global, which is going on. I would say in East Africa, we have pastoralism is a system which produces meat in a sustainable way, and has been for decades. The whole nyama choma trade, the roast meat, which the ordinary Kenyan eats, where that meat comes not from the ranches, it comes from pastoralism. And a country like Sudan, exports huge amounts of meat, largely through the informal channel, to Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, and it's mainly sheep, and it's often around sort of Eid when this is going on. Those animals have been reared in a sustainable way because you see it happening year in, year out, and it's using nature to do it. So when animals are reared on natural pastures using seasonal strategies, when there is not enough grass, the animals move on, and because they have to, there's nothing there. So if you understand how the system works, you realize that pastoralists, as long as they're mobile, do not degrade the environment as is commonly thought. These are just sort of misunderstandings. Solar power, absolutely brilliant. I know of examples in different parts of Africa where solar panels attached to small generators are actually highly effective in managing water because they're portable. And it allows, therefore, water points to be managed as a function of the availability of pasture. Therefore, you close down the water point effectively by moving away your solar generator, and then you can't get water out the ground. Therefore, the pastures are therefore rested. Rather than having a big diesel generator, which is very difficult to move around, you can close it, yes, but you can't then take it to another area of pasture where there is pasture but no water. So having a small generator is a way of being flexible and being much more agile and able to work with nature than against it.
Okay, I think we will continue to David and Anna Tuvesson. We have 8 minutes, so please, David, go ahead.
Thank you, Johanna, and thank you, David and Sed, for a great presentation. And I wanted to sort of return to the water scarcity issue a little bit. Seeing that sort of next year will be the UN Water Development Report will be on groundwater, and I guess this is one way you deal with water scarcity. You dig into the ground and take up the water that's below the surface. So in sort of these case studies, have you found that sort of shifting the governance structure, has that led to how should I put it, a better sustainability of water withdrawal? And I mean, the management of groundwater, did you see any effects on that? And also, hi Tom, I saw you were on the call. I just wanted to say hi to you as well. So thanks.
Okay, who will answer this?
I can have a quick stab at it, and then maybe Sed, you can step in after that. My understanding is that it's particularly in a place like Wajir, actually the groundwater is quite close to the surface, The water table is quite close to the surface, and some of the problems that they have are actually when the water table becomes polluted, because it is quite so close to the surface. I think the key point really about the governance here is the siting rather than the extraction, the amount that's extracted from the aquifer. So it wouldn't be, I wouldn't say that groundwater was the key issue in a place like Woodgere. That would be my observation. But said, I don't know if you have something else.
I think it's a really good question, David. And I think, to be honest, there's probably, I don't know enough about, to give you an honest answer on that. I think, it would depend a lot on context. I would say from logically, yes, having an improved governance framework around managing water should have a positive impact on sort of groundwater groundwater management as well. But I guess we would need to look for that evidence, in order to confirm that. But it makes sense. It should happen, but we need to see if it has.
I think we will now move to what I perceive as the last question. Please, Anna, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is Anna Tuvesson from the Swedish Embassy in Nairobi. Yeah, it's just a few comments, actually. I'm sorry I missed the presentation in the beginning. But just to underline, as has been mentioned here, and in our new strategy for cooperation with Kenya and how we try to operationalize it, that we have seen governance as really a key issue in environment, climate change, natural resources, water, everything. So we really try moving forward to make sure that we put effort on that, though it's not always easy to know how to do it. And also having noted that maybe the climate change adaptation resilience funding is where our investment money is going nowadays, not through like sectors like water, etc. And then trying to make sure that we build on the know-how, the best practice that has been built up for decades through sector approaches, so that they are also applied when we fund climate change adaptation programs. In Kenya, for example, I think that was one of the first ever SIDA climate adaptation programs as such, back in 2005-07, like that, support to the water resource user associations on adaptation related to drought. And then also just bringing up that perspective of now these climate adaptation programs that come and try to support really at the local level, based on demands at local level. Two challenges I'm thinking about. One is how you look at the impact at scale, like how do we really optimize and maximize the positive impact? Have we really looked at that strategically? We do some things that in thousands of places across the country, and also potential maybe negative impacts from that as well. And also the way we seem to, through several programs, focus on that local level, while, as sure I've heard people say here, we also need to address, for example, water resource management at a higher scale. We have helped through the Water Sector Trust Fund develop cross-county intervention frameworks on water resource management that goes beyond administrative borders, etc. But the water resource management institutions being so weak. So that's another area where we've identified. So I'll stop there, and I will go and watch the video, IIED, and remember that we get a lot of information from there. Thank you. It's really great to listen to this.
Well, thank you, Anna. And thank you, everybody, for joining in this, in my opinion, very, very interesting and challenging subject on how we actually try to assist people at local level to get a better livelihood and work with nature and not against it. And for those who missed the presentations, you can in the chat you find a link to it, and also you who have been present, now you have also direct contacts. You can contact David and said at IIED, you know, to continue this dialogue and make sure that we include valid information when we plan future cooperation within countries. You know, I mean, we also have examples of not so good water programs. Well, I know one in Tanzania, for instance, which was ongoing for many years, and which I think to a great extent you could consider was a failure, more or less. So I would really like to thank this hardcore group. I'm sorry we are not more, but I think that the most important people who were touched by this subject were present. So we will come back towards the autumn after the summer holidays. This was the third in our series, and you can find links to the previous recordings through IIED. So I don't know if Tom wants to say something or said, or David would like to just sum up, or if we say thank you here. Maybe Tom, please welcome.
We're out of time, but thanks for an excellent presentation and really thoughtful, interesting questions as well. Great example of how these seminars should work. So we're also really grateful to Johanna for making the connection, and it certainly seems like we had the right people on the call, which is the most important thing, as you say. So great to see everyone.
Okay, without further ado, I say thank you to all and have a very good summer, and look forward to meeting you all in the autumn. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.